He pulled me closer, his arm sliding around my waist, fingers pressing into my lower back, the robe falling fully open as I pressed against him. Hi guys, don't forget to share your thoughts below this video and press the like button. Your opinion matters to me. Now, let's dive into this story. The drive to the Hamptons stretched out like a ribbon of freedom unfurling beneath the tires of my old sedan, the summer sun spilling golden warmth through the open window. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, a cocktail of relief and nervous energy swirling in my chest. The city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, taking with it the suffocating chill of my marriage to Mark, a man whose ambition had long since eclipsed any flicker of affection he once held for me. After months of clipped silences and empty nights, I'd leapt at Serena's invitation to join her and our friends for a summer escape. Guilt lingered, a faint shadow, but the anticipation of breathing again, of feeling something, overpowered it. Serena, my best friend since college, had orchestrated this retreat with her usual flair, a cedar-shingled beach house perched atop a dune, its weathered facade promising lazy days and salt-kissed nights. The Atlantic stretched out ahead as I wound through the coastal roads, its endless blue a mirror to the hope I clung to. I needed this. The crash of waves, the laughter of friends, a chance to untangle the mess of my life with Mark. But there was a twist I hadn't braced for. Serena's stepson, Andrew, newly 21, would be joining us. I barely remembered him, a gangly kid with a shy grin from years back, but something about his name now stirred a faint, unplaceable curiosity. The house came into view as I crested the final hill, its sprawling silhouette framed against the sea, windows glinting like eyes catching the late afternoon light. I parked on the wide lawn, the scent of warm grass and brine flooding in as I stepped out, stretching my cramped legs. Serena burst from the front door, her blonde hair a wild halo in the ocean breeze, and enveloped me in a hug that nearly broke me. Her arms were firm, her perfume a sharp citrus, and I pressed my face into her shoulder, swallowing a sob born of months without touch, without closeness. "You're here," she sang, pulling back to beam at me, her blue eyes bright. "Everyone's settling in. Grab some sangria, pick a spot by the water. Andrew's down at the beach wrestling the waves. Kid's got no fear." I nodded, forcing a smile, the knot in my throat easing at her warmth. "Sounds perfect," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. More people meant distraction. Good. I hauled my suitcase up the creaking stairs to a second-floor room, its wide window framing a postcard view of the sea, whitecaps rolling in, gulls slicing the air. The bed was soft, piled with crisp linens, and I dropped my bag, running a hand through my dark hair as I caught my reflection in the mirror. At 38, I still turned heads. Long legs, a cascade of chestnut waves, a figure softened but firm, but Mark's indifference had dulled the spark in my hazel eyes. I shook it off, trading my travel-worn jeans for a light sundress, its hem brushing my thighs as I headed to the deck. Friends milled about, their voices a cheerful hum over clinking glasses. Sangria, tart and cold, passed between hands. I tried to join in, chatting about dinner plans, the weather, but the waves beckoned, their rhythmic hush pulling me down the sandy path to the shore. The sun hung low, gilding the water in molten streaks, and I kicked off my sandals, the sand warm between my toes. A cluster of surfers bobbed in the distance, dark figures against the glow, and one caught my eye, tall, broad-shouldered, carving a wave with easy grace. He rode it in, hopping off his board in the shallows, water streaming down his frame as he shook out his hair, a smile breaking across his face like a spark igniting dry wood. Our eyes locked as he strode onto the beach, and recognition hit me like a tide. Andrew, Serena's stepson, transformed. No awkward tween here, but a man, tan and lean, saltwater tracing rivulets over his chest, his damp shorts clinging to muscled thighs. His hair, dark and curling, framed a face that radiated youth and something dangerously alive. "Hey," he called, voice bright, carrying over the surf. "You must be Mom's friend. I'm Andrew." Up close, his eyes were a deep green, flecked with gold, and that smile, mischievous, warm, sent a jolt through me I hadn't felt in years. "Yeah, that's me," I said, forcing calm into my tone, though my pulse danced under my skin. "You're good out there." He laughed, a sound like sunlight on water, and ran a hand through his wet hair, droplets scattering. "Trying to be. It's freedom, you know? Just you and the waves." His gaze swept over me, slow, deliberate, lingering on the curve of my neck, the bare stretch of my legs beneath the dress. Nice to have company on shore, though. Heat flared in my cheeks, sharp and unbidden, and I blamed the sun, though I knew better. This was no innocent spark. This was a pull, thrilling and wrong, tugging at a hunger I'd buried deep. We stood in the shallow surf, the water lapping cool around my ankles, the breeze tangling my hair into knots. He talked about the waves, the board, college starting soon, and I nodded, half listening, caught by the way his lips moved, the flex of his arm as he gestured. His eyes kept finding mine, a flicker of something bold in them, and once, they dropped to my mouth, a beat too long, making my stomach flip hard. "Been a while since I've seen you," he said, voice softening, and I laughed, nervous. "Yeah, you've grown up." Too much, I thought, as his shoulder brushed mine climbing the deck steps later, a fleeting touch that sent electric pulses racing under my skin, leaving me dizzy and uncertain how I'd survive a summer with him so near. The deck buzzed with life that first evening, fairy lights strung overhead casting a golden glow across the weathered planks. Serena had outdone herself. Grilled fish glistened with lemon and herbs, shrimp curled pink and succulent, salads burst with color, and crusty bread steamed as it broke apart in eager hands. Laughter rolled over the clink of glasses, sangria sloshing ruby red, the air thick with salt and the tang of charcoal. I sat between old friends, their voices a comforting hum, but my nerves jittered every time Andrew moved into view. 2 seats down, he wore a linen button-down, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the fabric taut across his shoulders, his summer tan glowing against the pale blue. I caught myself staring, the curve of his forearm, the way his fingers wrapped his glass, and when his eyes met mine, a half-smile tugged his lips, knowing, electric, sending heat prickling up my neck. I laughed too loud at a joke, sipped too fast, anything to mask the pull tightening in my chest. He leaned forward once, passing a basket of bread, his arm brushing the table near my hand, and the air crackled, a silent thread tying us across the chatter. "Good to see you relaxing," he said, voice low, meant just for me, and I nodded, fumbling a reply about the food, the breeze, anything to dodge the truth. I wasn't relaxed. Not with him so close, his presence a magnet I couldn't resist. Dinner wound down, friends drifting inside, yawns cutting through the night. But I stayed, restless, the ocean's murmur calling me back. Midnight found me slipping off the deck, bare feet sinking into cool sand still warm from the day as I trudged to the shoreline. The moon hung full, a silver orb painting the beach in shimmering light, waves lapping soft and rhythmic against the dark. I dropped to my knees near the water's edge, the damp sand gritty under my palms, my sundress pooling around me. Thoughts of Mark swirled, his cold voice on the phone last week, his desk piled with work while I sat alone in our dim apartment, the chill of a bed too big for one. I pressed a hand to my chest, fighting the emptiness clawing up, the ache I'd carried too long. Footsteps crunched behind me, soft but sure, and I twisted, heart lurching as Andrew emerged from the shadows. His silhouette was sharp against the moonlit dunes, hands in his pockets, his shirt unbuttoned now, revealing the lean planes of his chest. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, voice gentle, a velvet thread in the night's hush. I shook my head, the break in my voice betraying me. "No." He settled beside me, close but not touching, the heat of him radiating through the inches between us, stirring my pulse into a frantic dance. The sand shifted under his weight, and I caught the faint scent of him. Salt water, sunscreen, something muskier beneath. We sat in silence at first, the waves a soothing pulse. Then he spoke, low and easy, about college. His new dorm, a surf club he'd joined, his words a lifeline pulling me from my spiral. I surprised myself answering back, my voice steadying as I confessed the hollowness of my days, the way Mark's absence had carved me out. "He's there, but he's not," I said, staring at the water, the moon's reflection fracturing in the ripples. Andrew listened, head tilted, his gaze locked on me, intense, unjudging. And it cracked something open, a need to be seen, heard, that I hadn't felt in years. A breeze swept in, cool and sharp, raising goosebumps along my arms, and he shifted closer, his shoulder brushing mine, warm through the thin fabric of my dress. My breath hitched, senses flaring at the contact, his skin firm, slightly damp from the night air, the faint prickle of sand clinging to him. "Cold?" he murmured, his voice a caress, and I nodded, unable to speak, the heat of him seeping into me, chasing the chill. He turned, his face inches from mine, moonlight catching the gold in his green eyes, and time slowed, the world narrowing to the space between us. His breath, faint and warm, brushing my cheek, the subtle flex of his jaw as he swallowed. Our eyes locked, a long, silent stretch drenched in unspoken want, and my stomach flipped, hard and fast. His gaze dropped to my lips, a flicker of hunger there, and my heart hammered, loud in my ears, drowning the waves. I could feel him, every inch of him, poised, waiting, the air thick with possibility. Fear surged, sharp and cold, Mark, Serena, the life I knew, and I stood, sand spilling from my knees, my breath shaky. "I need to get back," I whispered, but my feet didn't move, rooted by the pull of him. He rose too, slower, his brow creasing, disappointment maybe, or concern, and nodded, stepping closer, his hand hovering near mine, not touching but close enough to feel the heat. We walked back in silence, side by side, the dunes casting long shadows over the path. His arm brushed mine once, twice, each graze a jolt, his skin rough with sand, warm against my chilled flesh, building a tension that hummed low in my belly. At the deck steps he paused, turning to me, his eyes searching, dark and deep. "Night," he said soft, and I mumbled it back, climbing to my room on unsteady legs. I sank onto the bed, the sheets cool against my flushed skin, replaying his nearness, the weight of his shoulder, the whisper of his breath, knowing I'd felt something dangerous, something alive, and that it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The days after that moonlit night unfurled like a tightrope walk, each step a balance between restraint and the pull I couldn't shake. The beach house thrummed with life, mornings of coffee on the deck, afternoons of sunburned laughter by the water, but Andrew's presence was a current beneath it all, tugging at me. I stayed close to Serena and the others, filling my hours with chatter and card games, anything to keep him at arm's length. He played along, keeping a polite distance, but his eyes found mine across rooms, dark green, flecked with gold, a silent spark that made my skin hum. A brush passed me in the hall, his elbow grazing my side sent a shiver racing up my spine, and I'd catch his half-smile, subtle but deliberate, like he knew exactly what he did to me. Mark's shadow loomed in my mind, his clipped texts, "Busy, call later," the cold bed I'd left behind, but it faded against Andrew's warmth. Every laugh he shared with the group, every flex of his arms as he hauled a cooler, chipped at my resolve. My marriage had been a slow frost, each year with Mark icing over the woman I'd been, vibrant, desired, until I'd forgotten how it felt to be seen. Andrew's glances, his casual touches, woke that part of me, a thaw I couldn't stop. At night, I'd lie awake, the ocean's hush seeping through the window, my fingers tracing the sheets where Mark's absence ached, imagining Andrew's heat instead. One afternoon, the house emptied out, Serena and the others piling into cars for a shopping trip into town, their voices fading down the drive. I lingered on the deck, the sun high and relentless, claiming I needed a quiet day to read. Andrew stayed too, sprawled on a lounge chair with a book he barely opened, his excuse as thin as mine. The air hung still, thick with heat and the distant crash of waves, and I wandered to the beach, barefoot, the sand scorching under my soles. My sundress clung to my thighs, damp with sweat, and I crouched near the tide line, sifting through shells, smooth conchs, jagged oysters, letting the cool water lap my fingers. His footsteps crunched closer, steady and sure, and I didn't turn, though my pulse quickened, a drumbeat under my ribs. "You okay?" Andrew's voice came soft, probing, and I glanced up, shielding my eyes against the sun. He stood over me, shirtless, his tan skin glistening, shorts low on his hips, the faint line of hair trailing down his abdomen catching the light. "Yeah," I said, forcing a wry smile, my fingers tightening around a shell. "Just distracted." He knelt beside me, close enough that the heat of him brushed my arm, his knee sinking into the wet sand. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone gentle but edged, like he was peeling back a layer. The wind tugged at his hair, dark curls falling over his forehead, and I let out a shaky breath, the dam cracking. "It's Mark," I admitted, staring at the shell, pearly, fragile. We're not us anymore. It's been cold for so long." My voice wavered, and Andrew shifted closer, his shoulder grazing mine, warm and solid, sand rough against my skin. "You don't deserve that," he said, low, his fingers brushing the sand near my hand, not touching but close enough to feel the promise. I looked at him, caught by the sincerity in his eyes, the way they held me, raw, unguarded, and my defenses splintered. Silence fell, thick and heavy, the waves a steady pulse behind us. His gaze dropped to my lips, slow and deliberate, and my breath hitched, heat pooling low in my belly. "Andrew," I started, a warning, a plea, but he leaned in, closing the space, his hand hovering near my cheek. His lips brushed mine, soft, tentative, tasting of salt and sun-warmed skin, and I froze, a rush of guilt slamming into the longing flooding my veins. But my hands moved, traitorously slow, sliding to his shoulders, feeling the taut muscle beneath, and I pulled him closer, deepening the kiss. His mouth opened to mine, warm and firm, a quiet groan vibrating in his throat as his tongue grazed mine, sending a shiver down my spine. He pressed nearer, his chest brushing my breast through the thin dress, the friction igniting me, and I gasped into his mouth, my fingers digging into his shoulders, nails catching the faint grit of sand. His hand slid to my waist, warm through the fabric, pulling me flush against him, and I felt a hard line of him, his chest, his thighs, molding to me in the sand. The kiss stretched, slow and hungry, his lips tracing mine with a tenderness that belied the heat building between us. Salt clung to his skin, mingling with the faint musk of sweat, and I drank it in, dizzy, lost in the taste of him, the waves crashing a rhythm to match my pounding heart. We broke apart, breathless, my forehead resting against his breath hot on my swollen lips. "We can't," I whispered, tears pricking my eyes, my hands still clutching him, trembling. "I'm married, Serena. This is wrong." His face twisted, pain flickering in his eyes, and he cupped my cheek, thumb brushing my skin, damp with salt and want. "I know," he murmured, voice rough. "I'm sorry." But his touch lingered, a silent plea, and I sagged against him, chest heaving, the conch slipping from my hand into the surf. I pulled back, staggering up, sand clinging to my knees, and fled toward the house, guilt and desire warring in every step, his taste burning on my tongue, a line crossed I couldn't uncross. The days after that beach kiss twisted into a feverish dance of avoidance and ache. I threw myself into the group, mornings on the deck with coffee and gossip, afternoons splashing in the surf with Serena, evenings of wine and laughter. But Andrew was everywhere, a flame I couldn't douse. His presence burned at the edges of my vision, tossing a frisbee shirtless on the lawn, his laugh cutting through the chatter, or leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping water, droplets sliding down his throat. I'd catch his eyes across a room, dark and magnetic, and my breath would snag, heat curling low in my belly despite the guilt clawing my chest. We kept our distance, a fragile truce, but it frayed with every accidental touch, his fingers brushing mine passing a plate, the graze of his hip in a crowded hall, each contact a jolt that lingered on my skin. Mark's cold texts pinged my phone. "Work's insane, talk soon," and I'd stare at them, the frost of our marriage stark against the warmth Andrew stirred. Nights were the worst, the ocean's hush a lullaby I couldn't sleep to, my body restless under the sheets, replaying that kiss, the salt of his lips, the press of his chest, the way my hands had clutched him like he was air I'd been starving for. One midnight, the house slept, its creaks swallowed by the waves, and I slipped downstairs, barefoot in a thin robe over my silk camisole and shorts, the fabric whispering against my thighs. I needed water, something cold to steady the heat simmering under my skin, but as I padded into the living room, Andrew was there, pacing in the dim glow of a single lamp. He froze, his cotton tee clinging to his frame, shorts low on his hips, his hair mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. Our eyes locked, the air sparking, thick with the tension we'd buried since the beach. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, voice low, rough, stepping closer, his bare feet silent on the hardwood. My heart lurched, the glass trembling in my hand as I set it on the table. "Andrew," I started, a warning, my hands shaking. "You know we can't. There's too much at stake." He moved nearer, the heat of him brushing me, his scent, salt, musk, a hint of cedar, flooding my senses. "I know," he said, voice breaking, "but I see how you look at me, and it's the same way I look at you." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the lie stuck, his nearness a drug I couldn't refuse. A tear slipped down my cheek, guilt and want tangling, and he reached out, thumb brushing it away, his touch warm, tender, unraveling me. I stepped into him, burying my face in his shoulder, his shirt soft against my cheek, his heartbeat thudding under my palms. He murmured soft nothings. "It's okay. I've got you." His hands sliding slow up my back, fingers tracing the curve of my spine through the robe, sending shivers racing over my skin. I tilted my head, our breaths mingling, and his lips found mine, tentative at first, a soft press tasting of mint and longing, then deeper, his mouth opening, tongue grazing mine in a slow, hungry dance. I moaned, quiet, the sound swallowed by him, my hands fisting his shirt, pulling him closer as his arms tightened, pressing me flush against his chest. His body was hard, warm, the faint scratch of stubble grazing my jaw as he kissed me deeper, lips trailing to my neck, sucking gently at the pulse point until I gasped, heat pooling between my thighs. My robe slipped open, the silk camisole riding up, and his hands slid beneath, palms rough against my bare waist, igniting me. I arched into him, breasts brushing his chest, nipples tightening under the thin fabric, and he groaned, low and raw, his fingers digging into my hips, pulling me tighter. "God, you feel so good," he whispered, breath hot against my ear, and I shivered, my hands roaming his back, nails scraping lightly, feeling the flecks of muscle beneath. The moonlight spilled silver through the windows, bathing us in its glow, and he cradled my face, kissing me again, slow, deliberate, his tongue exploring mine with a reverence that made my knees weak. My fingers threaded into his hair, thick and damp, tugging gently, and he pressed his hips to mine, the hard ridge of him evident through his shorts, a jolt of need shooting through me. We sank onto the couch, my legs parting as he settled between them, his weight a delicious press, his lips trailing down my throat, nipping the soft skin above my collarbone. My robe fell open fully, the camisole hiked to my ribs, and his hand slid higher, cupping my breast, thumb brushing the peak through silk, drawing a whimper from me that he kissed away. Footsteps creaked upstairs, faint, distant, and we froze, breaths ragged, his hand still on me, my pulse hammering. "Someone's up," I whispered, panic slicing through the haze, and he nodded, easing off, his eyes dark with want and frustration. I pulled the robe shut, trembling, as he stood, adjusting his shorts, the tension between us a live wire. "Tomorrow," he murmured, voice thick, and slipped away, leaving me sprawled on the couch, lips swollen, skin flushed, the taste of him lingering, a promise of more I both craved and feared. The house thrummed with a restless undercurrent after that midnight kiss, days blending into a haze of stolen glances and fleeting touches. Mornings on the deck were a performance. Me forcing laughs with Serena, Andrew trading easy quips with friends, our eyes catching across steaming mugs, a quiet heat simmering beneath the surface. He was everywhere, his broad shoulders gleaming as he hauled a cooler to the beach, his voice cutting through the clatter of breakfast dishes, the way his shorts hugged his hips when he stretched in the sun. I'd feel the ghost of his scent, salt and cedar, in a hallway, my skin prickling, and retreat to my room, breathless Mark's curt texts, still busy, a stark chill against the warmth Andrew stirred. We danced around each other, a fragile truce fraying at the edges, his fingers brushing mine passing a napkin, the press of his arm against me in a crowded kitchen, each touch a spark that lingered, stoking a hunger I couldn't quench. Guilt gnawed at me, but it paled against the thrill of him, the way he woke something dormant in me. Nights stretched endless, the ocean's murmur taunting me through the window, my body restless under the sheets, replaying his lips on mine, his hands on my back, the hard press of him I'd felt in that shadowed living room. I'd lie awake, heart racing, knowing I was slipping too far, too fast. One afternoon, the group scattered. Serena and friends piling into cars for winery tours, their chatter fading down the drive. I stayed behind, claiming a headache, the house settling into a humid hush. Andrew lingered too, sprawled on the deck with a book he barely glanced at, his excuse as thin as mine. I drifted to the sunroom, an airy retreat with glass walls framing the sea, the sun pouring golden light across the hardwood. A plush chaise longue beckoned, and I sank onto it, my cotton dress clinging to my thighs, sweat beading along my collarbone. The door clicked shut behind me, and I turned. Andrew stood there, shirtless, his tan skin catching the glow, shorts low on his hips, his eyes tracing me with a hunger that stole my breath. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice soft but thick, stepping closer, his bare feet silent on the floor. I couldn't speak, my pulse pounding in my throat, so I reached for him, fingers trembling as they grazed his chest, warm and firm, the faint salt of the sea lingering on his skin. He knelt before me, hands resting light on my calves, his palms warm against my smoothness, sending shivers up my legs. Our lips met, tentative at first, a soft brush tasting of mint and sunlight, and then deeper, his mouth opening to mine, warm and slow, his breath mingling with mine in a quiet, hungry dance. I sighed into him, my hands sliding to his shoulders, feeling the taut muscle beneath, pulling him closer as his arms wrapped around me, pressing me gently against the chaise. He settled beside me, the chaise creaking softly, his chest brushing my arm through the dress, a faint friction that made my skin hum. My fingers dug into his shoulders, the faint grit of sand rough under my nails, and he kissed me deeper, lips trailing to my jaw, his breath hot against my skin as he nuzzled the curve of my neck. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, voice rough with want, his lips brushing the hollow of my throat, soft and deliberate, sending a shiver down my spine. I arched into him, the dress slipping higher on my thighs, and his hand slid to my waist, warm through the cotton, pulling me closer until our bodies pressed tight, his heartbeat thudding against mine. The sunroom shimmered, light dappling our skin through the glass, and he tugged the straps of my dress down, baring my shoulders, his lips following, slow, wet kisses along my collarbone, lingering at the base of my neck, each one igniting a flush that spread across my chest. My hands roamed his back, tracing the lean lines of muscle, and he groaned, low and soft, his breath warm against my ear as he pressed his forehead to mine. "I've wanted this," he whispered, his voice breaking, and I nodded, dizzy, my fingers threading into his hair, thick and curling, tugging gently as I pulled him back to my lips. The kiss stretched, slow and deep, his hands cradling my face, thumbs brushing my cheeks, a tenderness that made my knees weak. Our closeness built, a quiet rhythm of breaths and touches, his lips tracing my jaw again, nipping softly at the sensitive skin below my ear, my hands gripping his arms, feeling the flex as he held me. The chaise shifted under us, my legs brushing his, the heat of him seeping through the thin fabric of my dress, and I pressed closer, the ache in my chest blooming into something fierce, alive. His hand slid down my arm, fingers lacing with mine, squeezing gently, and I melted into him, the world shrinking to the sunroom, the glass fogging with our warmth, the distant crash of waves a faint echo to our shared pulse. Tires crunched outside, sharp, sudden, and we jolted apart, my breath ragged, his hand still tangled with mine. Serena's voice drifted through the hall, bright and oblivious, and I scrambled to fix my dress, smoothing the straps back up, my skin flushed with him. "Shit," I whispered, panic cutting through the haze, and he stood, running a hand through his hair, eyes dark with longing and frustration. He slipped out, silent, as I pressed against the window, trembling, the warmth of his touch lingering on my lips, my neck, a secret pulsing through me I couldn't erase as the door swung open to normalcy. The sunroom's warmth clung to me like a second skin as Serena's voice faded down the hall, groceries rustling, the group's chatter pulling me back to earth. I stood by the glass, smoothing my dress, my lips still tingling from Andrew's kiss, my neck flushed where his breath had lingered, his scent, salt, cedar, a hint of sweat, stayed on me, a secret I couldn't scrub away as I joined the others, forcing a smile, helping unpack bags with trembling hands. Andrew slipped in later, casual in a fresh tee, his eyes catching mine across the kitchen, a flicker of heat, a shared ache, and I turned away, heart thudding, the memory of his hands on my waist burning under my skin. Days spun into a tightrope act, the house alive with routine, breakfasts of toast and fruit, afternoons by the pool, evenings of grilled dinners under fairy lights. Andrew and I played our parts, polite strangers in the crowd, but the tension hummed, electric and unspoken. He'd brush past me in the hall, his arm grazing mine, the faintest press of his fingers sending a shiver up my spine, and I'd catch his gaze over a card game, dark and steady, promising more. Mark's texts grew sporadic. Conference ran late, and I barely replied, his absence a dull ache eclipsed by the pull of Andrew, the way he made me feel seen, alive after years of frost. Then Mark arrived, unannounced, shattering the fragile bubble I'd built. I was on the back deck, lost in the seagulls wheeling over the ocean, the late afternoon sun gilding the waves, when the rumble of a suitcase jolted me. My stomach clenched, dread pooling cold as I turned to see him stride through the foyer, tall, crisp in a button-down, his polite smile a mask I knew too well. "Surprise," he said, stepping onto the deck, arms opening, and I let him hug me, his embrace stiff, unfamiliar, his cologne sharp against the sea air. "Got free early," he added, and I nodded, forcing a "good to see you," my voice thin, the warmth of Andrew's touch a ghost against Mark's cold grip. Dinner was a summer barbecue in Mark's honor, ribs sizzling, corn charred golden, laughter loud over clinking beers. I sat beside him, his hand resting on mine, a public show that felt hollow, his thumb tracing my knuckles with rote affection. Andrew sat across, his jaw tight, eyes flicking to me, a storm brewing beneath his calm. "Nice to meet you, Mark," he said, voice smooth, shaking hands over the table, but I caught the tension in his grip, the way his gaze lingered on me, torn, furious, aching. We barely spoke, the air thick whenever our eyes met, a silent pull straining against Mark's oblivious chatter about work, deals, the city. That night, Mark cornered me on the deck, the group inside, the ocean a dark murmur below. "We need to talk," he said, voice low, insistent, his hand on my arm, firm but not warm. "We can work this out, us. I know things have been off." His idea of fixing us was always the same, me bending, him promising change he'd never deliver, and I nodded, mute, my mind drifting to Andrew's whispered comfort, the way his touch had felt like truth. "Sure," I mumbled, staring at the horizon, the guilt of my secret heavy, the longing sharper. He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure, but it only deepened the gulf between us. In bed, Mark slid under the covers, his body close, an assumption in his weight as he reached for me. I stiffened, the sheets cool against my skin, Andrew's kisses replaying, his lips on my jaw, his hands cradling me, while Mark's touch felt foreign, mechanical. His hand brushed my waist, a tentative move toward intimacy, but I turned, murmuring. Tired, my voice a shield. He sighed, rolling away, and fell asleep, his snores a steady drone. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Andrew's warmth a stark contrast to the cold space beside me, my body rigid with a longing I couldn't act on. Not here. Not now. Mark's presence turned every moment with Andrew into a minefield. Days stretched taut, him joining us for golf, me faking smiles at breakfast, Andrew hovering at the edges, his restraint a mirror to mine. We'd pass in the hall, his fingers brushing my hip behind a corner, a stolen touch that made my breath catch, his eyes dark with a promise he couldn't keep. Once, by the pool, he dove in, water streaming down his chest as he surfaced, and I watched, hidden behind sunglasses, my pulse racing as he shook out his hair, droplets catching the sun, his gaze finding me, bold and fleeting. One afternoon, Mark left with friends for a golf outing, Serena off on errands, the house falling quiet. I wandered to the den, sinking onto the sofa with a heavy sigh, the weight of secrets pressing down. Andrew appeared in the doorway, sunlight catching dust motes around him, his tea clinging to his frame, eyes raw with relief and want. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I murmured, voice trembling. Keeping it hidden, living with him like it's fine. He knelt before me, taking my hands, his palms warm, steady, the faint calluses rough against my skin. "Then don't," he said softly, thumbs brushing my knuckles. "You don't have to stay cold." Tears stung my eyes and he pulled me close, my face pressing into his shoulder, his shirt soft, his scent enveloping me, salt, warmth, him. Our lips met, slow and desperate, his mouth warm, tasting of coffee and longing, his hands sliding up my arms, fingers threading into my hair. I clung to him, the kiss deepening, a quiet moan escaping as his tongue grazed mine, his breath hot against my cheek. He held me tighter, lips trailing to my ear, whispering, "I'm here." His voice a lifeline, and I melted, the den fading, the guilt and fear drowned by the steady beat of his heart against mine. Mark's presence in the house turned every day into a tightrope stretched over a chasm, the air thick with unspoken strain. Breakfasts were a performance, me nodding at his work stories, Andrew sipping coffee across the table, his eyes flicking to mine with a heat that made my throat dry. Serena bustled around, oblivious, her laughter a stark contrast to the tension coiling between us. Mark played the devoted husband in front of the group, his hand on my back, a smile for the crowd. But it was hollow, a mask that slipped when we were alone, his voice clipped, his touch perfunctory. I'd catch Andrew watching, his jaw tight, a storm brewing in his green eyes, and I'd look away, guilt and longing knotting in my chest. Our connection couldn't be contained. It spilled into stolen moments, brief and electric. A brush of his fingers on my wrist in the kitchen, hidden by the counter, sent a shiver racing up my arm, his skin warm and rough with sand. In the hall he'd step close, his breath grazing my ear as he whispered, "Miss you." The words a spark that lingered long after he moved on. Each touch was a risk, a thread pulling tighter, and I craved it, craved him, despite the weight of Mark sleeping beside me, his snores a steady reminder of the life I was betraying. Andrew's warmth haunted me, a stark contrast to the cold space Mark left, and I'd lie awake tracing the sheets, imagining his hands instead. When Mark's breathing deepened into sleep, I'd slip out, heart pounding, the house creaking under my bare feet as I searched the shadows for Andrew. He'd be waiting, on the balcony, the air cool and briny, his silhouette sharp against the moonlit sea. Or in a guest room, the door ajar, his eyes catching the dim glow as he pulled me in. We'd kiss in hushed urgency, his lips warm, tasting of salt and mint, his hands cradling my face, fingers threading into my hair, each press a quiet rebellion against the world upstairs. His chest would press to mine, firm through his tea, and I'd cling to him, the faint scratch of stubble on my cheek igniting me, our breaths mingling in the dark. One night, after the house settled into silence, I found him by the pool, the water glowing turquoise under soft lights, the air heavy with chlorine and salt. I slipped off my sandals, the tiles cool against my feet, and dipped my toes in, the ripple catching the moon's silver sheen. Andrew sank beside me, his shorts brushing my thigh, his skin warm from the day, a faint sheen of sweat gleaming on his chest. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, voice low, tender, his shoulder nudging mine, a spark flaring where we touched. I shook my head, the water lapping gentle around my ankles, my robe slipping open to reveal the thin camisole beneath, clinging to my curves. His eyes roved over me, dark with want, and he shifted closer, the heat of him seeping through the humid night. "Are you sure you won't regret this?" he murmured, voice trembling, his hand resting light on my knee, warm and steady, sending a shiver up my leg. I turned, brushing my fingers along his cheek, the faint stubble rough under my touch, and leaned in, my breath shaky. "I regret every moment I've felt alone," I whispered. "With you, I don't." His gaze softened, relief and yearning flickering, and our lips crashed together, a hungry edge to the kiss, his mouth opening to mine, warm and firm, tasting of the night and him. He pulled me closer, his arm sliding around my waist, fingers pressing into my lower back, the robe falling fully open as I pressed against him, my chest brushing his, the thin fabric of my camisole a flimsy barrier to the heat of his skin. I moaned softly, the sound swallowed by his kiss, my hands roaming his shoulders, tracing the lean muscle, nails grazing lightly as his lips trailed to my jaw, slow and deliberate, sucking gently at the pulse point below my ear. "You're everything," he breathed, voice rough, his breath hot against my neck, and I arched into him, the pool's edge digging into my thighs, water splashing cool against my calves. His hand slid up my arm, fingers lacing with mine, squeezing tight, and I tugged him nearer, kissing him deeper, my tongue grazing his, a slow dance that made my head spin. The night wrapped around us, stars glinting above, the pool's glow casting shadows on his face, and he nuzzled my neck, lips brushing the soft skin above my collarbone, a tender nip that drew a quiet gasp from me. My legs tangled with his, the damp fabric of his shorts rough against my bare skin, and I pressed closer, the ache in my chest blooming into something fierce, alive, his heartbeat thudding against mine, a rhythm I couldn't let go. We stayed locked like that, breaths ragged, his forehead resting on mine, the water lapping a steady counterpoint to our shared pulse. "I don't want to stop," he whispered, voice thick, his hand cupping my cheek, thumb brushing my lips swollen from his kisses. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes, clinging to him in the hush, his warmth, his scent, the way he held me like I was all that mattered. The world beyond the pool faded. Mark, Serena, the consequences. Just us. A fragile moment stolen from the chaos, a promise whispered in the dark that we'd find a way, even as the storm loomed closer.